All right, so we'll get started. Hi, everyone, I'm not Edouard Machery, unless I'm very happy to welcome you to the center for our lunchtime talk with our last week of center talks before the winter break, sadly. But we are ending on some high notes, I'm sure. As usual, I'll read out some announcements for the talks and events that will follow the rest of the week. So tomorrow, actually, we have an online workshop with John Norton in his book that just came out with BSPS Press, The Large Scale Structure of Inductive Inference. That'll be at 11 a.m. on Zoom. You can find a registration link online at the center website or in emails from the center. And then the last lunchtime talk of the year will come on Friday, as usual at noon. That's December 6th with Eric Hochstein talking about mechanistic mating. Then we have a break, and when we return, I'm told Edouard will be back and giving us a talk, perhaps to kick off the new semester of. All right, so I'm going to introduce our speaker for today's talk. So today we have Hein, who is going to be telling us about Wundt and Kraepelin. Hein is assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Amsterdam, and before that obtained his PhD at the VU Amsterdam in history of philosophy of science in 2011, with a prize-winning dissertation on Kant's conception of proper science, as well as his philosophy of biology. Then, after obtaining a postdoctoral grant from the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Science, Hein received this grant, conducted some research on the history of biology at the Technical University of Dortmund, before he became assistant professor at the Institute for Logic, Language, and Computation at the University of Amsterdam in 2016. Does research on the history and philosophy of logic, biology, and psychiatry, and as a member of the Concepts in Motion group since 2011, he has been involved in a large number of computational and data-driven projects in the history of ideas. So with that, welcome, Hein, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Nice introduction. It's been great here. I'm going to miss you all when I return. I had a great time, and today I'll present what I did during my stay here. So I wrote an article on Wundt and Kraepelin, and the title, as you can see, is Wundt and Kraepelin: An Attempt to Ground Psychiatry as a Proper Science. So as you might know, Wundt is often called the father of experimental psychology, and Kraepelin is called the father of modern psychiatry. At least Wikipedia calls him that. And so it's two greats in the history of psychology and psychiatry, and they collaborated in a sense in this attempt to ground psychiatry as a proper science. So the survey of today is as follows. So I'll first give a small introduction. Then I'll talk about the historical context within which Kraepelin in psychiatry operated. And I'll talk about his predecessors, Griesinger, Meinert, and Wundt. Then I'll say something about Wundt on experiment and analysis. Then I'll say something about the same topics in Kraepelin. So I will talk about Kraepelin on experiment and analysis. And then finally, this is new for those of you who've read the paper, I've added a section on how followers of Kraepelin apply this experimental framework. So we'll see how followers of Kraepelin, we'll see that actually Kraepelin developed a fruitful experimental paradigm, which was adopted by his followers. So first an introduction. So I'll first give some biographical information. So here you have a picture from the public domain. I made sure it was from the public domain. From Kraepelin. So he was born in Australis, Germany. He did medical studies in Leipzig in 1874 and completed them in Würzburg. And already at this time he studied with Wundt. So already as a student he studied with Wundt. So he was influenced with Wundt. And then he got his PhD in Würzburg in 1878. And then in 1882, he worked in Wundt's laboratory. So as you might know, Wundt was a famous experimental psychologist, and he was especially famous also because of his organizational abilities. So he instituted journals, he made, and he developed his laboratory where people worked. And that was a sort of model for other laboratories throughout the world for a long time. And in this laboratory, Kraepelin worked. And then he became professor of psychiatry at Dorpat, of course. So that starts with Estonia, so the Baltic area. We'll see his inaugural lecture. I'll say something about his inaugural lecture there. Then he became department head in Heidelberg. So that's a move up, I guess. And then he became professor in Munich, where he was head of the Institute of Psychiatric Clinic also, and he died in 1926. So that's some of the biography of Kraepelin. And as you can see, so he studied with Wundt. Now, Vicky, and this is why modern psychiatrists, so it's funny that modern psychiatrists actually have written a lot about Kraepelin. And the reason is given by Wikipedia. So Kraepelin is there described as the founder of modern scientific psychiatry. And he's famous for his nosology, so his classification of psychiatric disorders or mental disorders, and especially the distinction between dementia praecox, which was later called schizophrenia, and manic depressive insanity, which is a distinction which is still made. So typically, modern psychiatrists are interested in his nosology and the influence of his nosology on modern practice. And so this is for Dejean. So in the late 20th century, there was sort of a revival of Kraepelin. So Kraepelin became and that's when Kraepelin became seen as the founding father of modern psychiatry. So there was a revival, and there became, so what was established was neo-Kraepelin perspective on psychiatry. So that became very popular during the latter third of the 20th century. And Engstrom and Kender, a famous historian and a famous psychiatrist, described his neo-Kraepelin perspective as follows. So psychiatry is a medical science, according to this perspective. It's diagnostic in focus, and then based mostly on the brain. So that's what distinguishes it probably from the psychoanalytic predecessors. So that's what was taken from Kraepelin. So focus on biological aspects of mental disorder. But interestingly, that will be the topic of today. So today I will talk about the early experimental work of Kraepelin. And Engstrom and Kender also already discussed this early experimental work, the focus of today, and they note that this doesn't fit this neo-Kraepelinian perspective. So it doesn't fit it at all, because the focus is on experiment and not so much nosology. And actually, Kraepelin is very critical of brain-based psychiatry in this early experimental work. So this is why the title of Engstrom and Kender's article, which is influential, is Icon or Reality. So Emil Kraepelin, Icon or Reality. So they say the reality is very different from this neo-Kraepelinian perspective. So today I will focus on the early experimental work, and Kraepelin's aim in this early experimental work was to synthesize the newly established experimental psychology of Wundt with psychiatry. So that was the aim of this early experimental work. So it was a synthesis, a combination of the early psychological, experimental psychological work of Wundt with psychiatry. And it's an attempt to ground psychiatry as a proper science. One of the many attempts, I'm guessing, throughout history. But Kraepelin was very enthusiastic about the psychology of Wundt and the potential for psychiatry. And this work, when it's debated, so there's some important literature on it, of course, as always, but this work is typically discussing the debate on whether Kraepelin's experimental work influenced his later nosological work. So they focus on whether Kraepelin's experiments influence his later classifications of mental disorders. And I want to adopt a new perspective. I want to investigate if Wundt's writing on logic, because I'm from the Institute of Logic, Language, and Computation, so that makes sense. So I want to investigate if Wundt's writing on logic can shed light on the methodological foundations of Kraepelin's experimental work. And here's important to know that logic in Wundt's time means something completely different than logic in our time. So logic in Wundt's time is really a methodology of the empirical sciences. So it contains lots of information about psychological methods. So you won't be noticing that I'm talking about logic throughout my talk, but actually I took all of it from Wundt's logic. So that's important. And this is a new perspective, this focus on logic, because logic is seldom considered, because interestingly, Kraepelin and many psychiatrists had a sort of atheoretical attitude. So they were very skeptical of philosophy. And that attitude, I think, is also adopted by some modern historians of psychiatry, and they think that a priori sciences have very little influence on empirical experimental sciences like psychiatry. But I wish to show the contrary. So logic formed the methodology of the sciences in this time and actually exerted a great influence on the psychiatric and psychological work of Wundt and Kraepelin. So I have four aims, I'll read them out. First, I show that experimental psychology, as envisioned by Wundt, is explicitly tied to the traditional method of analyzing compounds into more elementary parts. So the analytic method, as I call it. This analytic method is also applied by Kraepelin, who also ties the experimental method to the method of analysis and wishes to analyze complex mental phenomena, including complex mental disorders, into elemental mental parts. So they all adopted the method of analysis, which was if you know some of the history of logic, you know that the method of analysis was an integral part of the logic books in the 18th century. So they applied this experimental paradigm to the method of analysis in psychology and psychiatry. Second, I saw that contrary to the claim of Engstrom and Weber, Kraepelin in his early writings does not clearly move away from patho-anatomic studies of the brain, but instead wishes to refine patho-anatomic studies of the brain in an attempt to correlate via the method of analysis elemental mental phenomena and cerebropathic processes. So he does still think that brain studies can be relevant, and Engstrom and Kendler sometimes suggest the opposite. So that's my point here. I thought it was the only one, but then when I sort of submitted, I found out a very obscure paper by Hulke, unfortunately, who made the same point, but I think it doesn't really impact my paper that much. But credit where credit is due, Hulke also made this point. Third, I showed that Kraepelin's attempt to correlate inner mental phenomena to outer cerebropathic processes is again strongly indebted to Wundt, who in his physiological psychology attempted to correlate and explain how physiological outer processes are related to processes observed by inner observation. So also in this correlation attempt between brain states and mental disorders, you see the influence of Wundt. And then finally, I provide an interesting overview of Kraepelin's envisioned experiments. They're quite interesting from a modern perspective, as you might guess. And then now for the people who already written my paper, I have the followers of Kraepelin, so we'll take some time to discuss them. So first in historical context, so one of the main psychiatrists in Kraepelin's time was Wilhelm Griesinger. And Griesinger was very modern because he argued that mental disorder is a brain disease. And he noted that brain science is in its infancy, but the future diagnostics in psychiatry must be based on anatomy. So the hope was that brain science would develop and that we could find diagnosis and classification on the basis of the anatomy of the brain. And the reason that he thought that mental disorder is a brain disease was that the constant symptoms of brain disorders consist of anomalies of sensation of movement and of mental disorders, such as excitement or slowness of representations, loss of consciousness, delirium, and so forth. So he just noticed a sort of correlation between certain brain damage and psychiatric disorders, and then infer that mental disorder is a brain disease. Interestingly, he argues that mental disorders do not have single causes, but arise from a complex of multiple causes. And he says that predispositions are treated as causes, actually. So he noted that typical causes of mental disorder don't always lead to mental disorder, so you must be presupposed, he argued, and those were taken as causes. And he allows for social causes, so nationality, for example, and psychological causes, such as sadness, noting that they affect the brain. So they do affect the brain. But he was actually quite modern in his stress on social. So he also stressed social measures to intervene on psychiatric disorders. And then a follower of Griesinger was Meinert, who also lived in the 19th century. He typically also said that mental disorders are diseases of the brain, but very speculatively, he tried to relate specific disorders to specific brain malfunctions. So he just went all out speculative and said these kind of malformations of the skull, for example, cause these and these diseases. So they put all their eggs into the basket of mental disorder as a brain disease, and Kraepelin, as Engstrom and Kendler have also argued, was actually quite critical of brain-based science. So in his inaugural lecture in Dorpat in 1877, he laments that psychiatry lacks a commonly held foundation and is not making much progress. And here you see a quote from him about brain-based science. To date, it cannot be said that our understanding of mental disorders has been significantly advanced by the results of patho-anatomic studies of the brain. So he argued that the relation between the brain and mental anomalies is obscure. But importantly, and this has not been recognized in the literature, he does not give up on brain studies. He thinks we need to refine the methods. So we'll see later how he does this. He basically wants to adopt Wundt's framework on the analysis of the brain. But he does argue that Meinert's work is pure speculation, so he's very forthright in his assessment of Meinert. And so it's quite critical of brain-based science, and that says that we need to study the mental. And how do we study the domain of the mental? Enter Wundt. So the enterprise of psychiatry is to study mental phenomena. In order to study mental phenomena, you should have a mature science that is capable of studying mental phenomena, and that's Wundt. So here you see a quote. Over the course of the last decade, psychology has become a natural science like any other, and therefore it has a legitimate right to expect that its achievements receive the same respect and recognition as other auxiliary disciplines that we use to construct a scientific house. Just as alienists cannot presume to apply the theories and expressions of, say, neurophysiology in a way that's completely different from the original definitions, so too they should not be allowed to duck the responsibility of describing mental processes and conditions in a manner that is consistent and compatible with the science of psychology. So psychology provides the proper way to describe mental processes. That's a bit of the idea. And we should incorporate that in psychiatry. So, okay, what does Kraepelin adopt from Wundt? So I'll have a section on Wundt on experiment and analysis. So Wundt, as is well known, introduced the experimental method in psychology. So that's why he's also called the father of experimental psychology. But it wasn't only theoretical innovation, it was also mainly, like I said before, organizational innovation. So he established a laboratory that became a model for other laboratories, and he established journals. So it was mainly, and I think Kusch might talk to Dejan with the Kusch has written down all the professors who were students of Wundt, and there were a lot. So a lot of the philosophy, because philosophy and psychology were not yet distinguished. So a lot of the philosophy professors were actually students of Wundt in psychology in the 19th century. So there you see his immense organizational talents. But he argued that using the experimental method in psychology is a condition for psychology being a proper science. And here you should know a bit of the history. So Kant famously claimed in his metaphysical aanvangsgronden that psychology cannot become a proper science. And the reason that Kant claimed that was that psychology doesn't allow for experiment and psychology doesn't allow for the application of mathematics. So those were his reasons. And Wundt took that very seriously, and in his always works you see a refutation of Kant. So you see that he does allow that, so that it is possible to perform experiments in psychology. Now this method of the psychology is described in Wundt's logic. So his logic is divided in two parts. So there's a general doctrine of method, that's sort of the methodology that applies to all science, because it's general. And then there's a special logic of the sciences, and that's very interesting for modern readers. So you see the logic of the humanities, for example, you see the logic of psychology, you see the logic of physics, you see the logic of mathematics. It's very specialized and very concrete. And in that logic, he characterizes experiment as a means to actively intervene in nature. And interestingly, experiment is tied to causal explanation. So basically, he seems to adopt a view that typically, when you provide causal explanation, it's also based on experiment. And the idea is that through experiment, we can control the conditions under which a phenomenon occurs. And thus experiment allows us to answer the question of why a phenomenon occurs. And here's the criterion. As soon as an isolated condition regularly gives rise to an effect, we are justified in thinking that this condition is a cause of some sort. So that's how he views experiment. So, and then he has a large section on analysis, which I took out. So he makes a distinction between different types of analysis, but important for now is that he says the method of analysis and synthesis is generally are the general methods of science. So that's a very old-fashioned Aristotelian almost, or well, at least I'm not sure it's Aristotelian, but it dates to antiquity, of course, through progress. So the method of analysis and synthesis are the methods of all the sciences. And that will, as we shall see, was a doctrine that especially influenced Kraepelin. And here you see that, so here's an account of that experimental method is a means, according to Wundt, to analyze complex psychological representations into more simple representations. So through analysis, you analyze mental representations into more elementary parts. And Schmidgen, in a secondary article, has noted this, and he mentions reaction experiments as a typical example of experiments that perform this analytic function. And the reaction of experiments, the traditional reaction experiments, as they were described by Wundt, were performed through the operation of a telegraph key by a subject following the hearing of a sound caused by a ball colliding with a piece of wood. So an experimental subject would hear a sound, and then once they heard the sound, they would press a telegraph key. And the time that this process took was measured by the hip chronoscope. So the hip chronoscope measured the time between the sound made by the bell, the stimulus, and the operation of the telegraph key, the reaction. So that was a reaction measurement experiment. And as you see, Kraepelin adopted the same ideas. And according to Wundt, such reaction experiments investigated psychological ideas and not perceptions and sensations. And that's important because actually, so here you see the analytic function a bit already. Perceptions and sensations are parts of ideas. So that's the idea. So for Wundt, here you see the idea: physiologically determined elements of experience, sensations and perceptions tied directly to physical stimuli were transformed into representations of psychological phenomena when they were perceived when entering the visual field and apperceived when entering the visual point of attention. So we first have these physiologically determined elements, and then you do some psychological processes proceeds, and then we have more complex phenomena. So the ideas governing Wundt's experiments and the ideas of complex psychological representations are ultimately composed of more simple psychological or physiologically determined elements. So sensations are parts of ideas, that's the idea. And typically you might say that physiology studies the parts and psychology studies the wholes. That's a bit of the idea. And in this sense, the experimental method is seen as a method of analysis. And I think Wundt is very explicit. So in one work, he says that really experiments is just a method of analysis. So there you see the link between analysis and experimental method. And then finally, he talks about experimental method in his physiologische psychologie. That's a science that combines physiology and psychology. And as Wundt says, these are two sciences that study the same object, but with different methods. So physiology is concerned with those phenomena of life which can be sensed through our outer senses, while psychology is based on observation of inner life. And importantly, physiological psychology is fundamentally concerned with the relation between the outer and the inner. So this becomes clear if you again focus on sensations. So sensations are the elemental parts of inner phenomena. They're the elemental parts of psychology, studied by psychology. And in this work, he mainly studies sensations. And then here you see that psychology studies the relation between the outer and the inner. That becomes clear from a paraphrase from Kim. Wundt saw it as the task of the psychologist to investigate experimentally to what degree our estimation of the strength of sensory stimuli that we make, aided by our observations, corresponds to the stimulus real strength. So that's the idea. So we have the correlation between the real strength of the stimuli and our estimation of the strength of the stimuli. And we can investigate this experimentally by varying the psychophysiological stimulus in order to generate diverse internal sensations. And for Wundt, the ultimate task of such psychophysical investigation was to investigate lawful relations between stimulus change and change in sensations. So that was the idea. So we have different stimuli and different sensations and correlations and relations between these two aspects were studied within the psychology. So that's the relation between the outer and the inner. Okay, so I've discussed Wundt. So now I'll move on to Kraepelin. So Kraepelin, as I want to say in this section, really basically applied the entire framework of Wundt, including, very importantly, this method of analysis, which he worked with quite thoroughly. So he wanted to introduce the experimental method into psychiatry in order to ground psychiatry as a proper science. And he mainly wanted to make clear that psychiatry was really a medical science. So apparently he thought it necessary still in the 19th century. He wanted to say that moral faults were not an issue, right? For example, it's not a moral science. It's not moral faults that make you have mental disorders. So he saw the need to establish that psychiatry was really a medical science. But he also set himself the task to adapt psychology to the needs of psychiatry and to provide a proper psychological foundation of psychiatry. And the experiments Kraepelin wanted to introduce were primarily modeled on time measurements with the hip corneroscope and Wundt's reaction experiments. So we just saw an experiment of the example of the reaction experiments, and Wundt basically tried to do the same. Kraepelin basically tried to do similar experiments in his psychiatry. And the idea governing these experiments is that the idea is to compare the results of experiments with patients or with people with mental disorder to results of the same experiments that have been performed on healthy subjects without mental disorders. And in that way, hopefully, we can sort of chart the difference between normality and madness, so to say, so to speak. That was a bit of the idea that Kraepelin envisioned. So he spent quite a lot of time justifying these procedures. Of course, it's notably different to establish the distinction between normality and madness. I think modern psychiatrists would agree that that's an insanely difficult element. But Kraepelin thought that the experiments in Wundt's sense would help with this procedure. And he also notes that these experiments are very difficult because many of his patients for example, did not have the patience to undergo all these extensive testing. So because they would be ill, of course, and depressed, so no way. I'm not going to do this experiment. So those were difficulties. So here's some examples. So I'll read this out. Reaction experiments can be used to ascertain whether any degrees of extension of the process of apprehension, for example, apprehending a called out word, or any degrees of extension of the process of initiating a volitional act, for example, pressing a lever. If such extensions exist, if such extensions comprise a deviation from the norm of healthy subjects, we have psychological evidence for a mental imbalance. So there will be a reaction experiment, for example, calling out a word and pressing a lever. And if there would be any retardation in these psychological functions, then there will be a deviation from the norm. So that's one idea of a psychological experiment. And another interesting experiment is here, number 2 on the bullet point here. We can, with some probability, also infer to certain unusual psychological states if we are confronted with the occurrence of so-called faulty reactions, which equals failreactionen. So those are, for example, reactions in which people press the lever too early, when the stimulus is still working, right? So that will be a failreaction. And then Kraepelin argues the following: such faulty reactions occur under the influence of fatigue and alcoholism, as well as certain psychological conditions. And if a subject exhibits a large number of faulty reactions, we can refer to the existence of a decrease of psychological inhibitions or to a heightened psychomotoric excitability. So that would be his way of arguing that failreactions are related to. Well, I guess these would actually be viewed as elementary parts of mental disorder already. So there would be symptoms, for example, of a mental disorder. And then he notes finally that we can use experiments on association times, for example, the time spent associating two stimuli, to invent manic states called flight of ideas. And I think he adds that, contrary to what you would expect, it's not a heightened time, but a retardation of association. But in any case, one of the two can provide evidence for manic states. So that was his idea, to perform these kind of experiments to gain insight into mental disorders. Now, unlike Wundt, and this is the important part of my argument, Kraepelin assigns psychological experiment an analytic function. So he argues that we can analyze complex mental phenomena into more elementary, physiologically determined mental phenomena. And he says that we can apply the same method to mental disorders. So we can use the experimental method to analyze complex diseases or pathologies into more elementary disease forms or deviations from the norm. And here's an example of how Kraepelin thinks we can do this. So he argues that psychological experiments can use knowledge of some more elemental or basic psychological disturbances, such as heightened excitability, problems with memory, etc. So those are provided interest. So those are the elementary parts which form parts of more complex disease forms, such as manic depressive, for example. I'm giving more than an example, or schizophrenia. So here you see that Wundt applies the analytic method, Kraepelin applies an analytic method, just like Wundt. Now, what's the relation with nosology? Kraepelin often says that through psychological experiments, you can find the nature and essence of mental disorders. So that's a nice quote, right? It really shows that you can provide the nature, and that, of course, helps in providing classifications. So obviously, he envisioned this psychological work as providing foundation for later nosological work, and his experimental work is very important for his nosology. So psychological experiments allow us to more precisely characterize mental disorders, which may help in the diagnosis and classification of mental disorders. But then, and here I come to his brain-based study. So, like I said, right, there are some people who argue that Kraepelin, or suggest that Kraepelin totally moves away from brain-based psychiatry, but I argue that he actually refines the methods of brain-based psychiatry. He thought that the incorporation of experimental psychology into psychiatry will improve research in patho-anatomy. So that was his hope. And this is really a hope. We'll see later in the psychological experiments that they never arrived at this idea. But it's an ideal that governed the experiments. And we must, and here you see the similar idea like Wundt. So, like I said, Wundt's thought of his physiological psychology as a way to correlate the outer and the inner. And we must, like Wundt in his physiological psychology, specify the correlations between corporal events or the outer and mental events or the inner in psychiatry. And this is achieved by adopting the method of analysis in both patho-anatomy and psychiatry. We analyze with the help of experimental psychology morbid phenomena into elemental parts and correlate these with elemental cerebropathic processes. So that's the idea. We chop up a mental disorder in parts and then we correlate these to elemental brain states, basically. So that was the ideal of brain research that Kraepelin envisioned. And here you see a nice quote that illustrates this idea. If detailed investigation of the parallelism of psychopathic and cerebropathic processes is to be the ultimate goal of our clinical endeavors, then it appears that this goal is attainable only if we succeed in dissecting step by step the complicated symptoms of mental and corporal life, and thereby learn which of the respective individual functions on each side manifest a reciprocal and low-governed dependency on one another. So here you see the quote that illustrates this. So basically this again follows from the method of analysis. We apply the method of analysis to mental disorders. We apply the method of analysis to brain research, and then we can correlate and find parallelisms. This quote is a bit made difficult by the term parallelism, but I'll leave that out for the moment. We can get it back into the Q&A. But to give you some background, Wundt was a parallelist, and they denied the causal interaction between outer states and internal states. So there was no causal interaction, but there was a parallelism, and there was correlation. And this parallelism was actually often invoked as a means to actually investigate these correlations and these relations between the outer and the inner. So they thought very highly of empirical research, but they had a strange metaphysical idea that there was no causation involved. And then finally, to end with Kraepelin, he has some remarks on the experimental study of exogenous and endogenous mental disorders. So exogenous mental disorders are, for example, studied by fatigue. So he wanted to investigate experimentally fatigue and fluctuations of mental capacities during the day. So what's the impact of fatigue on the mental capacities that you have during the day? And he was vehemently against alcohol. So he understood the problems of alcohol in psychiatry, and he wanted to perform experimental studies on the effects of alcohol. And then there were endogenous mental disorders, which are, according to Kraepelin, disorders of the personality. And he notes that the quantitative treatment or measurement of personality traits will help in studying endogenous mental disorders. So he thought that we should study personality traits as possible factors that contribute to the rise of mental disorders. And here's how he envisioned studying these personality traits. So we can use many experimental methods, such as reaction experiments, experiments on memory and association of representations, to measure and characterize the so-called capacity for performance of certain personalities. And then hopefully correlate certain values of this capacity with people with mental disorders. So this is basically the potential of a personality, right? How much can you memorize and how much can you count and how much. So that's the Leistungsfähigkeit in German. And then he correlated another personality trait, so Übungsfähigkeit. In a similar fashion, we can measure the capacity for practice. The measure in which practice increases the amount in which people can perform certain tasks. So they would perform tasks and then see a certain, they would wait a while, and then after a while you should see the effect, right, of practice. So if you count quicker after a while. And then after a while, fatigue, of course, again sets in, and you count slowly. So that's a bit of the idea. So that was the Übungsfähigkeit. And Kraepelin specifies several general types of measures that we can determine through experimental methods, and that allows to gain a quantitative characterization of personality types. So that was how he thought the study of personality types could contribute to the emergence of mental disorder. Okay, and then this is, I dedicate this section to Edward. Edward said, I would like to know if it was a fruitful research program. So I studied some of his followers, and actually it was quite fruitful. But I must add a caveat in the journals of Kraepelin. So, right, and I'm going to investigate the impact more thoroughly in a follow-up project, hopefully, which I'll say something about you later. So, so this is one of his followers, Axel Oorn. He wrote a study called Experimentele Studien zur Individualpsychologie, so experimental studies on individual psychology. And the idea was to provide insight into individual psychological variations of individuals that deviate from common general psychological laws and schemas that characterize whole populations of subjects. So it would really be about the variation of individual subjects. So how does the counting of numbers vary across individual subjects, and how does the memorization of syllables vary across individual subjects? So that was the idea. And Oorn expresses the hope that his research can also shed light on psychopathology, given that we may gain insight into the genesis of disorders by looking at certain experiences of individuals and their variation. But as you shall see, this relevance for psychiatry sort of fades to the background. So it seems to me that if you look at this, a lot of this experimental work, that many were quite satisfied to just do traditional psychological experiments, and that the ultimate goal of psychiatric relevance sort of was an ideal, but never really established or never really fulfilled in a certain way. And Oorn experimentally studied processes of perception, memory, association, and motoric functions through a variety of experiments. And he used regular intervals of 5 minutes to calculate the number of finished individual tasks. For example, the amount of letters counted in the interval. So there would be intervals, and then there would be a measure, and we would see how many letters are counted in the interval. So here's one example of the counting of letters. So he used the Latin script of the Roman historian Livius. Then every experimental subject got a task for a certain section to count the amount of letters with the greatest speed as possible. And when 100 letters were counted, this would be notated, and the subject would start at 1 again. And after 5 minutes, the section would be notated in a different way. So that's the experiment. And then the result was written down as follows. So the quantity of work done would be measured by dividing 5 minutes, just 300 seconds, through the amount of letters counted. And then we would have a measure of how many letters are counted. And he would extend this sort of simple experiment also to the analysis of fatigue, for example, right? Because you would have a curve, and then later on you would see the effect of fatigue setting in. And also the effect of practice, you could see the same over a period of time. So it would be extended into these domains. And then he performed similar experiments on memory and association. So for the experiments on memory, Oorn devised experiments with memorizing meaningless rows of syllables and rows of numbers. And in order to obtain knowledge of the process of association, Oorn measured the addition of numbers. So those were similar experiments. And in the presentation of the results, Oorn remarks that the idea behind the experiments was to keep the external conditions of the experiments as constant as possible, in order to let the experiments provide insight into the psychological variation of the experimental subjects. So he even goes as far as to write down the ages of all the experimental subjects, of course, and then he would say, see, there's not that much difference. And by the way, they weren't blinded, interestingly. So the experimental subjects would be there with their full name, it was Kraepelin, among others. And then you could check whether what the variation was. And the results of the experiment were then presented in a table in which one could easily see the individual variation in performance of a psychological task between the experimental subjects. So for example, in the case of the experiment of counting letters, the tables would consist of 4 rows with the following data: the names of the experimental subjects, abbreviated with single letters, the number of letters counted in an hour for each experimental subject, the time taken for counting 1 letter, And then the average variation, methodological, and I spent an hour thinking what that might be, and I thought it might be the mean deviation, but it wasn't when I looked at the numbers. So it wasn't the mean deviation, but it was, it's defined as the quantity of variation for performing the task for each single experimental subject during the duration of the entire experiment. So that would be the methodological. And then you would see indeed the variation of all these subjects. So some are very good at counting numbers, others are less good. Some are very good at memorizing certain results, and some are less good. So I would say that all these experiments fit the experimental paradigm of Kraepelin, the typical psychological experiments. But note, right, that the psychiatric relevance of these experiments was work in progress. So it was really an experimental paradigm in progress, and right, the psychiatric relevance was really something needed to be established. And I'm not sure what the eventual verdict is. So I read some psychiatrists from the 1920s or 30s or 40s. So very old. And they said that actually the psychological revolution in psychiatry never happened. So they were skeptical. But I talked to Edward and he thought maybe otherwise. So it depends on your viewpoint. So but we can conclude that Kraepelin thus devised an experimental psychiatry modeled fully on the works of Wundt and developed a paradigm that was endorsed by several of his followers. And I want to do so, like Jonathan said, this introduction, I'm part of the Concepts in Motion group. So we do data-driven studies. And what we basically do is we build a model of a concept and we devise annotation rules, and then we annotate tons of stuff. And then you get numbers about acceptance or rejection of a certain concept. Right? So, and I thought it would be nice to do this on this experimental paradigm on psychiatry, so that you could see the impact that the experimental paradigm of Kraepelin that it had on the development of psychiatry in the early 20th century. So that's part, it's not all of it, but it's part of a research project which I submitted. And that's that. So perfect.
All right, so we'll take a 5-minute break, turn for questions.